July 1944. The air in Texas was a physical weight, a shimmering, suffocating blanket woven from heat and dust. For the men of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, now prisoners of war in Camp Hearne, it was a landscape more alien than the frozen steppes of Russia or the blasted sands of North Africa. The sun was not the familiar, benevolent star of a German summer. It was a white-hot furnace eye, merciless and absolute. It baked the soil into a cracked, pale ochre canvas and bleached the very color from their threadbare uniforms. They were ghosts haunting a purgatory of their own making, their reality stripped down to the rhythmic drudgery of camp life. The morning roll call, the meaningless labor under the hostile sun, the thin, tasteless meals, the long, silent evenings, heavy with the twin burdens of defeat and uncertainty. Their minds, however, were anything but silent. They were fortresses built from the granite of ideology and mortared with years of relentless propaganda. Inside these mental redoubts, they replayed the old certainties. America, they had been taught, was a mongrel nation, a chaotic experiment in decadence and materialism, spiritually hollow and militarily inept. Its soldiers were soft, undisciplined boys raised on chewing gum and jazz music, lacking the iron will and sacrificial spirit of the German soldat. The country itself, a fragile house of cards built on Jewish finance and Negro labor, was surely crumbling from within. Its resources stretched thin by a war it had no business fighting. They clung to these beliefs as a shipwrecked sailor clings to a piece of driftwood, for to let go was to drown in the terrifying ocean of their present reality. They viewed their captors through this distorted lens, interpreting every action as proof of their preconceived notions. The guards' casual demeanor was not professionalism, but laziness. The absence of routine brutality was not a sign of a different code of conduct, but of weakness, a lack of the necessary hardness to wage total war. They were watching, waiting for the cracks to appear, for the facade of American strength to crumble and reveal the rotten core they knew must lie beneath. They were soldiers still, engaged in a battle of perception, determined to win the war of wills, even if the war of machines was lost. But a new rumor, an unsettling whisper, had begun to snake through the barracks, carried on the searing Texas wind. It spoke of an upcoming celebration, something called the 4th of July, an American holiday. And for this day, the camp authorities were planning something special for the prisoners. Not extra work, not a punitive drill, but a feast. If this exploration of wartime psychology resonates with you, consider subscribing for more stories that uncover the hidden truths of history. The very idea was ludicrous, an absurdity that provoked cynical laughter, a feast for them, the enemy, in the midst of a global war. It was, they concluded, a crude and obvious propaganda ploy, a theatrical display designed to break their morale with a charade of generosity, a trick as transparent as glass. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a veteran of the brutal siege of Leningrad where men had boiled leather for sustenance, spat into the dust. He had seen the true face of war, had tasted its bitter dregs. This American sentimentality, this childish belief that a full stomach could sway a man's convictions, was pathetic. It was the ultimate confirmation of their enemy's naivete, a weakness they would exploit by accepting the food with stoic contempt, their loyalty to the Reich undiminished. The day arrived, not with the pomp of a parade or the gravity of a state ceremony, but with a smell. It began in the early morning, a scent utterly foreign to their European senses, drifting from a cordoned-off area near the camp's kitchens. It was not the familiar, acrid smell of coal smoke or the sharp, greasy odor of a field kitchen frying potatoes. This was something else entirely. It was a slow, sweet, and deeply complex aroma of burning wood, hickory, and mesquite, though they did not know the names, intertwined with the unmistakable tantalizing scent of roasting meat. It was a primal, ancient smell, a scent that spoke of fire, patience, and abundance. It curled into the barracks, under the doors, through the window screens, a fragrant invader that bypassed all their mental defenses and spoke directly to the hollow ache in their bellies. As the sun climbed higher, their curiosity warred with their disdain. They watched from a distance as the American guards, stripped to their undershirts in the heat, tended to what looked like monstrous black metal coffins on legs. These were the smokers, arcane contraptions from which plumes of lazy blue-white smoke issued forth. The guards' movements were unhurried, almost ritualistic. They were not working with the grim efficiency of soldiers on duty. They were laughing, sharing stories, drinking cool beverages from glass bottles. They moved with a casual, confident ownership of their environment that the prisoners, even in their own homeland, had never truly known. It was the posture of men for whom plenty was not a temporary victory, but a permanent state of being. For Klaus and his comrades, this scene was a profound source of cognitive dissonance. This was not a military operation. It was a party, a festival of wastefulness while a world burned. What hidden histories lie behind the everyday rituals we take for granted? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The prisoners were herded towards the mess area in the late afternoon. The smell was now overwhelming, a thick, savory cloud that made their mouths water despite their resolve. And then they saw it. Spread out on long tables were platters piled high with food, a bounty so vast it seemed impossible. There were mountains of sliced beef, the meat so tender it seemed to shimmer, each piece rimmed with a dark, almost black crust, the bark, as their captors called it. There were heaps of shredded pork, glistening and succulent. There were links of thick, ruddy sausage, taut and ready to burst. And it was not just meat. There were vats of potato salad, bowls of creamy coleslaw, deep trays of beans thick with molasses and pork, and stacks upon stacks of impossibly soft, pure white bread. They were given trays and utensils, and the American cooks, sweating and grinning, piled the food on with a casual generosity that bordered on the obscene. There were no strict rations, no carefully measured portions. A scoop of this, a slab of that, a ladleful of beans. "Eat up, Fritz," one of the cooks said, his voice devoid of malice, filled only with a simple, guileless pride in his craft. The prisoners shuffled forward, their faces masks of stony indifference, but their eyes betrayed them. Their pupils were wide, fixated on the feast before them. This was more meat than many of them had seen in the past 3 years combined. It was a king's ransom, a warlord's tribute, and it was being handed to them on a metal tray as if it were nothing. They retreated to their tables, the weight of the food on their trays a tangible shock. For a long moment, they just stared at it. The meticulously constructed edifice of their beliefs was beginning to tremble. Propaganda could create fake newsreels, stage photographs, and broadcast lies, but it could not fake this. It could not fake the weight of a pound of brisket, the smoky perfume rising in the hot air, the sheer, undeniable physical reality of this much food. This was not a trick of the light. This was real. This was the first tremor, the first sign that the world they thought they knew was built on a foundation of sand. And the earthquake was coming. Enjoying this deep dive into a forgotten chapter of history. Don't forget to like this video and share it with a fellow history enthusiast. They ate in a stunned, almost reverent silence. The first bite was a revelation, a sensory explosion that obliterated years of deprivation and ideological certainty. The brisket was a testament to the power of time and low heat. It was unbelievably tender, the fibers dissolving on the tongue. It had a profound smoky flavor, layered with the spicy rub that had formed its crust, a complex taste that spoke of patience and a deep understanding of fire and meat. It was nothing like the boiled, stringy beef of their rations or the gristly, hastily fried pork of a field kitchen. This was not merely fuel for the body, it was something more. It was an art form. The pulled pork was a different kind of miracle, soft, moist, and infused with a smoky sweetness that was both alien and intoxicating. The sausage snapped when bitten into, releasing a torrent of savory seasoned juices. Even the side dishes were a source of wonder. The creamy, cool potato salad was a perfect counterpoint to the rich meat. The sweet, tangy beans were a meal in themselves. The white bread, soft as a cloud, was a luxury they had forgotten existed, perfect for sopping up the precious barbecue sauce, a substance so flavorful and complex it defied their culinary vocabulary. They ate with a slow, deliberate intensity, savoring every mouthful, trying to commit the experience to memory. The silence at the tables was a living thing. It was not the sullen silence of defiance, but the profound silence of shock. It was the silence of men whose entire framework for understanding the world was being systematically dismantled, bite by delicious bite. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with a shared, unspoken question. If the lies about American deprivation were this monumental, what other lies had they been told? What other truths had been hidden from them? The food on their plates was no longer just a meal. It had become evidence. It was Exhibit A in the trial of their entire worldview. The initial shock soon gave way to a dawning, horrifying realization. This was not a one-time event. As the weeks turned into months, they saw the patterns of American abundance. The barbecue, or variations of it, reappeared for other holidays, or sometimes for no reason at all, just a Saturday. They saw the daily deliveries to the camp's kitchens, trucks laden with crates of fresh vegetables, sides of beef, whole hogs, sacks of flour and sugar. They worked on local farms as part of their prisoner duties and saw the reality of American agriculture. They saw fields of corn stretching to the horizon, vast herds of cattle grazing on endless pastures, and machinery that did the work of 100 men. If you find these moments of historical revelation as compelling as we do, please support our channel by subscribing. This was not a nation on the brink of collapse. This was a nation of such staggering, effortless plenitude that it could fight a global war on two fronts and still afford to feed its enemies with a quality and quantity of food that a German general could only dream of. The cognitive dissonance was a physical ache, a constant pressure behind the eyes. Everything they saw contradicted everything they had been taught. The propaganda had spoken of a decadent, weak society, but what they witnessed was a system of production so powerful, so overwhelmingly efficient, that it seemed almost like a force of nature. The guards, those simple farm boys and mechanics, became objects of intense study. The prisoners had expected to see the dregs of the American army, the unfit and the incompetent left behind to watch over captives. But the men who guarded them were healthy, strong, and well-fed. They complained about the heat, about being bored, about missing their girls back home, but they never complained about a lack of food or equipment. They treated their rifles with a casual familiarity, but they treated the preparation of their weekend barbecue with a focused seriousness that bordered on religious devotion. This simple, recurring ritual of the barbecue began to haunt the prisoners. It was a constant, tangible reminder of the chasm that separated their reality from their enemies. They would watch the smoke rise from the pits and understand that each plume was a signal of their own nation's failure. Germany, a state organized for total war, a society that had sacrificed butter for guns and demanded absolute austerity from its people, could not match the casual, thoughtless bounty of a single prisoner of war camp in the middle of Texas. The war was not just being fought on the battlefields of Europe. It was being fought and won in the fields, factories, and kitchens of America. The realization settled in not like a sudden blow, but like a slow, creeping paralysis. They had been prepared to die for their Vaterland, to endure any hardship, to make any sacrifice. But how could one fight this? How could a nation built on an ideology of scarcity and struggle compete with a nation for whom abundance was a birthright? The stories behind the statistics of war often reveal the most about the human condition. Join our community to explore more. This constant exposure to an undeniable truth began a profound and painful process of psychological unraveling. The internal fortresses of their ideology, once thought impregnable, were being eroded from the inside out. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the process was one of slow, agonizing disillusionment. His cynicism, once a shield, now became a lens through which he saw the terrible truth. He had been a part of the machine that had ground millions to dust on the Eastern Front, a war fueled by a desperate, plundering logic: conquer the next territory to seize its resources, to fuel the machine to conquer the next. It was a war of perpetual, ravenous hunger. He would sit under the shade of a barracks, the taste of smoked brisket still a phantom on his tongue, and he would compare. He remembered the German Eintopfsonntag, the one-pot Sunday, a mandatory national ritual of austerity where families ate a simple stew to save resources for the war effort. It had been celebrated as a symbol of national solidarity and sacrifice. Here, in an enemy prison camp, he had just eaten more high-quality protein in a single meal than an entire German family would see in a month. The comparison was so stark, so devastating, it felt like a physical blow. The sacrifice of his people, their stoic endurance, their unwavering belief in their cause, It all seemed like a tragic, pathetic farce in the face of this reality. He looked at the American guards, at their well-fed bodies, and their easy confidence. He had once dismissed them as soft. Now he saw their strength in a different light. It was not the brittle, fanatical strength forged in the fires of ideology, but a deeper, more resilient strength born of prosperity and security. These men weren't fighting for a desperate, abstract concept of Lebensraum. They were fighting to protect this world of plenty, of weekend barbecues, of a life where a full belly was not a privilege, but a baseline expectation. Klaus realized with a chilling certainty that Germany was not at war with an army. It was at war with a way of life, and it was a war it could never, ever win. For Hans, the young zealot, the experience was even more traumatic. His entire identity had been forged in the crucible of the Hitler Youth. He had been taught to revere the state, to despise its enemies, and to believe in the absolute righteousness of the National Socialist cause. The Americans were supposed to be subhuman, a degenerate mix of races incapable of true culture or courage. The barbecue was the first crack in this carefully constructed reality. It was not a soulless, mass-produced meal from a factory. It was a craft. It required skill, patience, and a communal spirit. The men who made it took pride in it. They shared it freely. They used it as a tool for social bonding. Let us know in the comments which aspect of this cultural collision you find most compelling. He began to watch the guards, not as an enemy to be hated, but as a puzzle to be solved. He saw them playing baseball, a game of complex rules and individual skill. He heard them listening to their music, a vibrant, emotional art form he had been told was decadent noise. He saw them receive letters from home, their faces showing the same love, fear, and longing he felt for his own family. They were not the one-dimensional caricatures from the propaganda posters. They were just men, and they were the victors. The realization was a poison that seeped into his soul, killing his faith. If the propaganda was a lie about the nature of the enemy, then the entire ideology it served was built on lies. His sacrifice, his belief, the deaths of his friends. What had it all been for? He felt a profound sense of betrayal, a hollow emptiness where his fervent belief used to be. Gefreiter Gunther Lang, the pragmatic NCO, experienced the shift not as an emotional crisis, but as a cold, hard calculation. Gunther was a man of logistics, of numbers and resources. His mind worked in terms of supply lines, tonnage, and man-hours. The barbecue for him was not a meal. It was a logistical equation of terrifying complexity. He mentally cataloged the inputs. The cattle, raised on vast plains, fed with grain from immense harvests. The transportation network of railways and trucks required to move the animals to the slaughterhouses and then the meat to this remote camp. The industrial capacity to manufacture the smokers, the utensils, the refrigerated trucks. The fuel, the gasoline and diesel to power it all. He compared this effortless expenditure with the German war economy, the Kriegswirtschaft. He knew its realities intimately, the constant shortages, the reliance on ersatz materials, the brutal seizure of resources from occupied lands, the desperate recycling of every scrap of metal and rubber. The German war machine was a marvel of efficiency born of desperation. The American war machine, he now understood, was a marvel of efficiency born of overwhelming, inexhaustible power. It was like comparing a meticulously crafted dagger to a tidal wave. The dagger might be a work of art, but the tidal wave simply erases the landscape. Gunther would lie on his cot at night, the Texas moon casting long shadows across the barracks floor, and he would do the math. He calculated the caloric content of his meal, multiplied it by the number of prisoners, and then tried to extrapolate what that meant for the American domestic economy. The numbers he arrived at were astronomical, impossible. They bespoke a superpower of a different order of magnitude, a new kind of empire built not on conquest and subjugation, but on production and consumption. He had been trained to fight and win battles. He now knew, with the certainty of a mathematical proof, that his side had already lost the war, and this barbecue was simply the victory banquet for the other team. A banquet they were so rich they could afford to share with the losers. The psychological impact was devastating. It was a quiet, internal defeat, more absolute than any surrender on the battlefield. It was the humiliation of realizing your own sacrifice was meaningless, the awe of seeing your enemy's true strength, the envy for a life you could never have, and the dawning bitter respect for the system that had created it. We believe that understanding the past is key to understanding the present. If you agree, please subscribe and join our historical explorations. The summer wore on, and the barbecue ritual became a fixed point in the prisoner's new reality. It was no longer a shock, but a recurring lesson in humility. The initial disbelief had burned away, leaving behind the cold ashes of acceptance. With this acceptance came a new level of perception. They began to see that the barbecue was more than just a meal. It was a symbol, a complex cultural artifact that explained the enemy in a way no intelligence briefing ever could. It was the key that unlocked the enigma of America. One sweltering Saturday afternoon, as they sat eating, Klaus Richter watched a young American guard meticulously saucing a rack of ribs. The guard moved with an artist's focus, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a soldier performing a duty. He was a craftsman engaged in his passion. In that moment, Klaus understood. The barbecue was not a display of waste. It was a display of mastery. It symbolized a fundamentally different relationship with the material world. In Germany, resources were to be hoarded, controlled, and deployed with ruthless efficiency by the state. Here, resources were so abundant they could be wasted on the slow, inefficient, and glorious pursuit of perfection. This slow-cooking process itself was a powerful metaphor. The German way of war was the blitzkrieg, a philosophy of speed, violence, and frantic urgency, born of the knowledge that a long war of attrition could not be won. The barbecue was the antithesis of the blitzkrieg. It was a celebration of slowness, of patience. It was the confident belief that one could afford to wait, that time was an ally, not an enemy. It implied a nation so secure in its power that it did not need to hurry. It could take 8, 10, 12 hours to cook a piece of meat simply because it tasted better that way. This casual mastery of time was the ultimate expression of power. For Hans, the symbolic shift came from the communal nature of the event. In the Hitler Youth, community was a tool of the state. It was a forced, top-down conformity, expressed through torchlight parades, mass rallies, and unquestioning obedience. Individuality was suppressed in favor of the collective will. The barbecue was the opposite. It was a voluntary, bottom-up form of community. Families and friends gathered not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. It was a ritual that strengthened social bonds through the simple human acts of preparing and sharing food. It celebrated a different kind of strength, not the strength of a monolithic state, but the strength of a free and prosperous civil society. The war had stripped them of their individuality, reducing them to a number, a component in the great machine. Here, they watched their captors act as individuals, laughing, arguing about the best kind of wood to use, sharing their own personal recipes for rubs and sauces. It was a chaotic, inefficient, and vibrant expression of freedom. Hans realized that the strength of America did not lie in its government or its army alone, but in the cumulative power of its 130 million free citizens, each pursuing their own version of happiness, whether it was building a factory or perfecting a barbecue sauce. If our content helps you see history from a new angle, consider supporting our work by becoming a channel member. It was Gunther, the pragmatist, who saw the final, most devastating symbol. He looked beyond the food itself to the infrastructure that supported it. The barbecue was a product of the American system, a fusion of agrarian bounty and industrial might. It was the end result of a chain that began with a farmer in Iowa, continued with a steelworker in Pittsburgh who made the smoker, a trucker in Illinois who drove the rig, and a chemist in New Jersey who perfected the charcoal briquettes. It was a symphony of decentralized free market cooperation. This was the force they were truly fighting against. Not just an army, but a fully integrated economic and cultural system that could produce both B-17 bombers and perfect baby back ribs with equal terrifying proficiency. The German system, for all its claims of superiority, was a brittle, centralized command economy built on conquest. The American system was a dynamic, adaptable, and endlessly creative engine of production. The barbecue on his plate was not a meal. It was the ultimate weapon. It was the edible manifestation of a superior way of organizing a society. In that moment of collective realization, sitting under the oppressive Texas sun, the war in Europe became a distant, irrelevant echo. The thunder of artillery and the scream of Stukas were meaningless. The real war, the war of systems, of ideas, of ways of life had been decided. It was decided here, in the quiet of a prison camp, with the taste of smoke and sugar on their tongues. This meal was not a prelude to their defeat. This meal was their defeat. It was their unconditional surrender not to the American army, but to the American reality. The war in Europe would rage for another year, but for the men in Camp Hearne, it was already over. The formal surrender on a battleship in Tokyo Bay or in a schoolhouse in Reims would be a mere formality, a postscript to the verdict that had already been delivered on a paper plate in Texas. The legacy of this experience was etched into the souls of the men who survived to return home. They came back to a Germany that was not just defeated, but annihilated. They walked through the rubble of their cities, saw the gaunt, hungry faces of their families, and breathed the air of a nation in ruins. The contrast between this grim reality and the memory of their captivity was a source of profound and lasting torment. That memory, the memory of the Texas barbecue, became a secret, a shared touchstone for those who had experienced it. What small, unexpected event in history do you think had the biggest psychological impact? Let us know in the comments. Klaus Richter, the hardened veteran, never spoke to his children of the horrors of Leningrad. Instead, in his old age, he would sometimes tell his grandchildren a strange story about a prison camp in a hot, dusty land where the enemy fed them like kings. He spoke of the taste of smoked meat with a reverence he never used when speaking of medals or battles. He was trying to explain something he had learned that day, that a nation's true power is not measured in its capacity for cruelty and destruction, but in its capacity for creation and generosity. He had learned that the most effective weapon is not one that takes a life, but one that changes a mind. Hans, the disillusioned youth, rejected all forms of ideology for the rest of his life. He had seen firsthand how a grand, heroic narrative could be obliterated by a simple, undeniable fact. He became a quiet man, a carpenter who found solace in the tangible, honest reality of wood and tools. For him, the memory of the barbecue was a constant reminder of the danger of abstract ideas and the profound truth of human experience. He had gone to war to fight for a glorious lie and had found a humbling truth on an enemy's dinner plate. His personal war ended not with a bang, but with the quiet internal collapse of his faith. Gunther Lang, the logistician, became a key figure in the rebuilding of his town's small manufacturing sector. He applied the lessons he had learned not from German military manuals, but from his observations of the American system. He argued for innovation, for investing in his workers, for understanding that prosperity was not a zero-sum game. He had seen the power of a system that could generate wealth instead of just seizing it. The memory of the barbecue was his blueprint for the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. He understood that a nation that could master the art of slow-cooked brisket could certainly master the art of building cars and cameras. These men and thousands like them carried this memory home with them. It was a testament to a different kind of victory. The Second World War was not won by tanks and bombers alone. It was won by the colossal, undeniable power of American production, a power so immense that it could afford to be generous, a power symbolized perfectly by the simple, profound, and world-altering experience of a Texas barbecue. It was a lesson in power, a sermon on systems, and for the German prisoners of war who tasted it, it was the unforgettable flavor of final defeat.